On the morning of December 23, 1944, at 9 a.m., Oberfeldwebel Hans Kruger crouched in the commander's cupola of his Panther G tank, watching the fog that had blanketed the Ardennes for 8 days finally begin to lift. Thin shafts of sunlight penetrated the overcast sky, illuminating the narrow road ahead where his Kampfgruppe had been stalled for 3 hours, waiting for fuel trucks that should have arrived before dawn. At 32 years old, he was a veteran of the Russian front with 2 years of armored warfare experience, and he understood immediately what clear skies meant for German forces that had advanced 30 kilometers into American lines while protected by weather that grounded Allied aircraft. The fog had been their greatest ally since the offensive began on December 16th. Under its concealing blanket, 3 German armies had smashed through thinly held American positions in the Ardennes, creating a bulge in Allied lines that threatened to split the British and American armies. Kruger's 2nd Panzer Division had pushed deeper than any other formation, reaching within 4 kilometers of the Meuse River at Dinant before grinding to a halt when fuel supplies failed to keep pace with their advance. Now his regiment was being redirected south toward Bastogne, the critical road junction that American paratroopers had somehow managed to hold despite being completely surrounded. The Panther's engine idled roughly, consuming precious fuel while Kruger waited for orders that would either send them forward toward Bastogne or back toward their supply depots. The 45-ton tank was arguably the finest armored vehicle in the world, equipped with a 75mm KWK-42 gun capable of penetrating any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, protected by sloped armor that could defeat most American and British anti-tank weapons. But its Maybach HL-230 engine consumed fuel at rates that made sustained operations impossible without constant resupply, and the chaotic logistics situation meant that fuel convoys were arriving hours or days late, if they arrived at all. Beside Kruger's Panther, 15 other tanks sat motionless on the narrow road that wound through dense pine forest. The column included 8 more Panthers from his company, 4 Panzer IV medium tanks, and 3 Tiger I heavy tanks from the attached Schwer Panzer Battalion. Each vehicle represented months of industrial production and irreplaceable trained crews, concentrated on a single road because the muddy tracks through the forest couldn't support their weight. The tactical vulnerability of such concentration was obvious to every experienced officer, but the road network in the Ardennes offered few alternatives, and speed was essential if they were to reach Bastogne before American reinforcements broke the siege. At 0927 hours, Kruger heard a sound that made his blood freeze. A distant rumble that grew rapidly louder, accompanied by a high-pitched whine that was unmistakable to anyone who had experienced air attack. He grabbed his binoculars and scanned the southern sky, seeing nothing but broken clouds and patches of blue. The sound intensified, coming from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting not a single aircraft but an entire formation approaching at low altitude. His radio operator was already shouting warnings to the other tank commanders, but there was nowhere to go. The narrow road was flanked by muddy ditches and dense forest that would bog down any vehicle attempting to leave the hardened surface. The first P-47 Thunderbolt appeared at 0928 hours, emerging from behind a ridgeline 3 kilometers south and diving toward the stalled German column at a 30-degree angle. The aircraft was massive compared to the fighters Kruger had seen on the Eastern Front, with a barrel-shaped fuselage and wide wings that seemed too large for its speed. But the Thunderbolt was moving at over 400 miles per hour in its attack dive, closing the distance to the German column in seconds while its pilot lined up the distinctive shapes of tanks that stood out clearly against the white snow covering the surrounding fields. Captain Robert Mike Mitchell, leading the 4-plane flight from the 365th Fighter Group's 387th Fighter Squadron, had been airborne for 35 minutes, flying from their forward airfield at Chivres in Belgium. The mission briefing at 0800 hours had been straightforward: armed reconnaissance along the roads leading to Bastogne, with primary targets being German armor and supply vehicles attempting to reinforce units besieging the surrounded American paratroopers. Mitchell's P-47 D-28 RA carried 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, with 425 rounds per gun for a total ammunition load of 3,400 rounds. Additionally, his aircraft carried 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs and 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, making it a flying weapons platform capable of destroying the heaviest German armor. The P-47 Thunderbolt had entered service in 1943 as a high-altitude escort fighter, designed around the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower and gave the 7-ton aircraft performance that matched or exceeded lighter German fighters above 20,000 feet. But by late 1944, the Thunderbolt had evolved into perhaps the most effective ground attack aircraft in the Allied arsenal, combining heavy armament, rugged construction, and the ability to absorb tremendous battle damage with pilot protection features that made it popular among the men who flew it into concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Each of the 8.50 caliber machine guns fired bullets weighing 1.7 ounces at muzzle velocities of 2,840 feet per second, delivering kinetic energy sufficient to penetrate light armor and shred softer targets. The guns were synchronized to converge at a point 300 yards ahead of the aircraft, creating a cone of fire that concentrated all 8 weapons on a target area roughly 6 feet in diameter. At the maximum rate of fire of 800 rounds per minute per gun, a P-47 with all guns firing could deliver 106 rounds per second onto its target, though pilots typically fired in 2 to 3 second bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent barrel overheating. Mitchell's Thunderbolt screamed down toward the German column at 430 miles per hour, the aircraft vibrating as he pushed it through the denser air at low altitude. His gun sight was a simple reflector type that projected an illuminated reticle onto a glass plate, showing where the bullets would strike if the target maintained its current position and velocity. Stationary targets were ideal for strafing attacks, and the German tanks sitting motionless on the road below presented perfect targets that required minimal corrections for lead or deflection. Mitchell had destroyed 11 German vehicles in the past 2 weeks, including 3 tanks confirmed by gun camera footage, and the concentration of armor below represented the most target-rich environment he had encountered since the Normandy campaign. The first burst struck Kruger's Panther at 0928 and 15 seconds, with .50 caliber rounds walking up the road surface and then impacting the tank's engine deck at a steep angle. The Panther's frontal armor was nearly impervious to .50 caliber fire, but its thinner top armor could be penetrated by rounds striking from above, particularly when armor-piercing incendiary ammunition was used. Mitchell's guns were loaded with a mixture of ball, armor-piercing, and incendiary rounds in a standard belt pattern that maximized effectiveness against various target types. The armor-piercing rounds punched through the Panther's 40mm engine deck armor, while incendiary rounds ignited fuel vapors and hydraulic fluids that turned the engine compartment into a furnace within seconds. Kruger felt the impacts as hammer blows against his tank's hull, accompanied by the distinctive sound of heavy machine gun bullets striking steel. The engine note changed immediately, rising to a high-pitched scream as damage to the cooling system caused temperatures to spike beyond redline limits. He ordered his driver to shut down the engine while simultaneously traversing the turret in a futile attempt to bring the main gun to bear on an aircraft that was already past his position and climbing away to the north. Smoke began pouring from the engine grills, thick and black with burning oil, and Kruger knew his Panther was finished even if fire suppression systems prevented complete destruction. The second and third P-47s in Mitchell's flight struck the column in rapid succession, each aircraft diving from slightly different angles to maximize coverage of the strung-out German vehicles. Lieutenant James Crawford targeted a Tiger I heavy tank that sat at the center of the column, its 54-ton bulk taking up the entire width of the narrow road. The Tiger was virtually immune to .50 caliber fire from any angle, its thick armor designed to resist 76mm anti-tank guns at combat ranges. But Crawford was carrying rockets, and at 0929 hours he fired 2 5-inch FARs from 800 yards range while pulling out of his dive. The high-velocity aircraft rockets left the launching rails at 1,150 feet per second, trailing smoke as they streaked toward the German column. The HVAR was essentially a scaled-down artillery rocket, carrying a 45-pound warhead that could penetrate 4 inches of armor plate or create a blast effect equivalent to a 155mm artillery shell. Crawford's first rocket missed, impacting in the forest 20 yards beyond the road, but his second struck the Tiger's right track assembly and detonated with a flash that was visible from 3 kilometers away. The explosion shredded the track and damaged 2 road wheels, immobilizing the massive tank and blocking the narrow road for any vehicles behind it. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber commanded the stricken Tiger, and he scrambled to assess damage while his crew prepared to abandon the vehicle if fire reached their ammunition storage. The Tiger carried 92 rounds of 88mm ammunition, each containing enough explosive to destroy the tank if cooked off by fire. Weber's radio was already filling with panic transmissions from other commanders whose vehicles had been hit in the first attack wave, creating a chaos of overlapping voices that made coordinated response impossible. The tactical doctrine for dealing with air attack was clear: disperse, find cover, and increase anti-aircraft fire, but the narrow road made dispersal impossible, forest cover was too dense for tanks to penetrate, and the few anti-aircraft vehicles in the column were positioned at the rear where they had no clear shot at attacking aircraft. The 4th P-47 in Mitchell's flight, flown by Lieutenant Donald Parker, attacked from the east at a shallow angle, his 8 machine guns stitching a line of impacts across 3 Panzer IV medium tanks that were clustered together on a straight section of road. The Panzer IV's thinner armor made it vulnerable to .50 caliber armor-piercing rounds even from the side, and Parker's concentrated fire penetrated the lead tank's side armor, killing the driver and setting ammunition on fire. The Panzer IV's 75mm rounds began cooking off in a series of explosions that blew the turret completely off the hull and sent it tumbling into the ditch beside the road. The violence of tank ammunition exploding inside a confined space was unlike anything experienced by infantry under fire. Temperatures inside the burning Panzer IV exceeded 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit as propellant charges ignited, creating pressures that burst hull seams and ejected flames from every opening. The 3 crew members who had not been killed by the initial strafing run had no opportunity to escape before their vehicle transformed into a blast furnace that consumed everything organic within seconds. The fireball served as a beacon for additional Allied aircraft that were now converging on the area from multiple directions, drawn by radio calls announcing the discovery of a German armored column. Mitchell's flight completed their strafing runs and climbed back to 8,000 feet to assess damage and coordinate with additional flights that were approaching the target area. Gun camera footage would later show that the initial attack had destroyed or damaged at least 5 German tanks and killed or wounded an estimated 20 soldiers who had been riding on the vehicles or standing nearby. More importantly, the psychological impact on the German column was immediate and severe. Veterans of the Eastern Front were accustomed to Soviet air attacks, but the Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft they had faced in Russia typically attacked individually or in pairs. The Americans were coordinating flights of 4 to 8 aircraft that attacked in rapid succession, leaving defenders no time to recover between waves. At 0935 hours, a second flight of 4 P-47s from the 362nd Fighter Group arrived over the German column and immediately began attack runs from the north. These aircraft were carrying napalm, jellied gasoline in drop tanks that could be released to tumble toward targets before igniting on impact. The weapon was relatively new to the European theater, having been used extensively in the Pacific against Japanese positions, but it proved equally effective against German armor concentrated on narrow roads. Captain Thomas Bradley released his 110-gallon napalm tank from 1,200 feet, watching it tumble downward before exploding in an orange-red fireball that engulfed 2 Panzer IV tanks and a half-track loaded with infantry. The napalm's effect was both immediate and prolonged. Jellied gasoline adhered to metal surfaces and continued burning at temperatures that could melt aluminum and soften steel, while consuming all oxygen in the immediate area and creating toxic smoke that made breathing impossible. The half-track's infantry dismounted in panic, their uniforms on fire as they rolled in the snow trying to extinguish flames that clung to fabric and flesh with equal tenacity. Medics attempting to help burned soldiers discovered that conventional first aid was useless against injuries that covered entire bodies with third-degree burns, while the acrid smoke made evacuation of wounded impossible until winds cleared the area. Kruger watched the napalm attack from his disabled Panther, understanding that his column was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that could strike from any direction without warning. The Americans had achieved complete air superiority over the battlefield, and clear weather meant that German forces would face continuous attack throughout daylight hours. His radio operator reported that regiment was ordering all units to disperse into the forest and camouflage their vehicles until darkness allowed movement without air attack, but half his company's tanks were already burning or damaged beyond repair, and dispersal would consume precious fuel needed for combat operations. The next wave of P-47s arrived at 0947 hours, these aircraft from the 406th Fighter Group carrying 500-pound bombs in addition to their machine guns and rockets. Bombing from a fighter bomber required different tactics than strafing, with pilots beginning their dives from 8,000 feet and releasing weapons at approximately 3,000 feet before pulling out to avoid fragmentation from their own bombs. The P-47's dive brakes helped control speed and improve accuracy, though hitting a target the size of a tank required skill and experience that separated veteran pilots from newcomers. First Lieutenant Michael Romano had flown 43 combat missions since D-Day, and his bombing accuracy had improved with each sortie until he could regularly place 500-pound bombs within 50 feet of aim point from 3,000 feet altitude. The German column below presented multiple targets spread along 400 yards of road, and Romano selected the cluster of tanks near the immobilized Tiger as his aim point. His dive angle was 45 degrees, steeper than typical strafing runs, and his airspeed climbed past 450 miles per hour as the target grew larger in his gun sight. Romano released both 500-pound general-purpose bombs at 3,100 feet, then immediately pulled up with enough G-force to gray his vision at the edges while he climbed away from the target area. The bombs took approximately 3 seconds to fall the remaining distance to impact, during which time their ballistic trajectory was influenced by wind, air density, and the forward velocity imparted by Romano's aircraft. Both weapons struck within 30 feet of their aim point, one landing directly on the immobilized Tiger and the other impacting beside a Panther that had pulled into the ditch trying to find cover under trees. The 500-pound bombs contained 272 pounds of Composition B explosive that detonated with a blast pressure exceeding 300,000 pounds per square inch at the point of impact. The Tiger I's thick armor could resist this pressure from a near miss, but a direct hit concentrated the explosive force in ways that no armor could withstand. The bomb penetrated the Tiger's engine deck and detonated inside the hull, the blast wave rupturing welds and blowing out the belly armor. The 54-ton tank lifted several inches off its suspension before crashing back down, its internal structure destroyed even though external appearance suggested only moderate damage. Oberleutnant Weber and his crew were killed instantly by blast overpressure that pulverized internal organs before they could react. The Tiger's ammunition did not immediately explode, but fires started by the blast would eventually reach stored rounds and create secondary explosions that would continue for the next 20 minutes. The second bomb struck beside the Panther in the ditch, its detonation creating a crater 8 feet deep and 15 feet across while hurling fragments that shredded the tank's side armor and tracks. The crew evacuated immediately, knowing their vehicle was combat ineffective even if it hadn't caught fire. By 1015 hours, the German column had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 16 tanks that had been stalled on the road 90 minutes earlier, 11 were confirmed destroyed or severely damaged, while the remaining 5 had dispersed into the forest where their ability to maneuver or fight was severely limited. The supporting infantry and supply vehicles had suffered proportionate casualties, with trucks burning along a 2-kilometer stretch of road and wounded soldiers being evacuated on foot because medical vehicles couldn't reach their positions through the wreckage. The psychological impact on surviving German tank crews exceeded the physical destruction of their vehicles. Kruger gathered 8 survivors from his company in a small clearing 200 yards from the road, conducting a hasty reorganization while aircraft continued circling overhead like hunting birds. His gunner, Unteroffizier Klaus Schmidt, was trembling uncontrollably despite the cold, his eyes wide with shock that went beyond fear into something approaching psychological breakdown. Schmidt had survived the retreat from Stalingrad and fought through 2 years of Eastern Front combat, but he had never experienced the helpless vulnerability of being attacked by an enemy he couldn't fight back against. The doctrine of armored warfare that had served Germany so well in 1939 to 1941 was predicated on coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support that could concentrate overwhelming force at decisive points. But by December 1944, the Luftwaffe was virtually absent from the battlefield, leaving German ground forces to face Allied air power without protection or hope of retaliation. Kruger's tankers had learned to move only at night or during periods of poor visibility, but clear weather meant they would face continuous attack whenever they left concealment. The offensive toward Bastogne required movement in daylight, which meant accepting casualties that no army could sustain. The Americans maintained continuous fighter-bomber coverage over the roads surrounding Bastogne throughout December 23rd and 24th, flying over 1,200 sorties that destroyed an estimated 80 tanks and 500 other vehicles. The P-47 Thunderbolts bore the majority of this effort, their rugged construction allowing operations from rough forward airfields while their heavy armament made them effective against all vehicle types. Pilots developed tactics specifically for the Ardennes terrain, using valleys and ridgelines to mask their approach before climbing to attack altitude and diving on German columns that had no warning until guns opened fire. The terror experienced by German tank crews was compounded by the randomness of survival. Tanks positioned at the front of columns were hit first but might survive if following aircraft targeted vehicles behind them. Tanks in the middle faced concentrated fire from multiple aircraft but might be obscured by smoke from burning vehicles. Tanks at the rear could sometimes reverse away from attack zones, but retreat meant abandoning comrades and invited court-martial for cowardice. Experienced commanders tried to space their vehicles to minimize losses from any single attack, but road conditions and tactical requirements often forced concentrations that invited devastating strikes. Major Heinrich Brandt commanded the Panzer Battalion that included Kruger's company, and he filed a report on December 24 describing the impossibility of continuing offensive operations under conditions of absolute enemy air superiority. His battalion had begun the Ardennes offensive with 42 operational tanks and had lost 27 to air attack in 8 days, while losing only 3 to ground combat. Replacement vehicles were unavailable because factories in Germany were being bombed around the clock by Allied strategic bombers, while replacement crews required 6 months of training that was no longer available as fuel shortages curtailed instruction. The relief of Bastogne was accomplished not by any single action but by the cumulative effect of air attacks that prevented German reinforcements from reaching the besieging forces. Patton's Third Army advanced from the south through territory where German mobile reserves had been destroyed or scattered by fighter-bomber attacks that killed command and control capabilities as effectively as they destroyed physical equipment. On December 26, elements of the 4th Armored Division reached the American paratroopers who had held Bastogne for 10 days, breaking a siege that had consumed German offensive strength without achieving any strategic objective. Kruger survived the Ardennes campaign and eventually surrendered to American forces in April 1945 after his last tank was destroyed by P-47 attack near the Ruhr Pocket. His post-war interview with U.S. Army historians described the psychological impact of facing air attack as more debilitating than any other combat experience, including the Eastern Front. The sound of approaching aircraft created physical reactions, accelerated heartbeat, shallow breathing, involuntary trembling, that persisted even when no actual attack materialized. Sleep became difficult because dreams replayed the experience of being trapped inside a burning tank or watching helpless as comrades were killed by weapons against which courage and training offered no defense. The P-47 Thunderbolt's effectiveness in the ground attack role was recognized by both sides as a decisive factor in the Battle of the Bulge. German commanders cited Allied air superiority as the primary reason for their offensive's failure, noting that all territorial gains were achieved during the period of bad weather that grounded Allied aircraft, while the advance collapsed within days of clear weather returning. American after-action reports credited tactical air power with preventing German reinforcements from reaching critical points, particularly around Bastogne where the road network created choke points that concentrated targets for air attack. The technological and tactical superiority represented by the P-47 reflected broader American advantages in industrial production, pilot training, and logistics that determined the war's outcome as surely as any battle. Each Thunderbolt represented thousands of hours of factory labor, hundreds of pounds of strategic materials, and a pilot who had received 200-plus hours of flight training before entering combat. The Germans could produce individual weapons systems that matched or exceeded Allied equivalents, but they could not match the systematic application of industrial power that put thousands of aircraft over the battlefield simultaneously while maintaining reserves that replaced losses within days. The 8.50 caliber machine guns that terrified German Panzer crews were not revolutionary weapons. They were the same Browning M2 design that had entered service in 1933. But their installation in a stable gun platform that could deliver accurate fire while diving at 400+ miles per hour, combined with tactics that coordinated multiple aircraft against single targets, created a weapons system whose effectiveness exceeded the sum of its components. German tank crews feared the P-47 not because of any single capability but because it represented an integrated system of air power that they had no means to counter or evade. The relief of Bastogne and the subsequent collapse of the German offensive marked the end of the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct strategic operations on the Western Front. The casualties suffered during the Ardennes campaign, particularly losses of armored vehicles and experienced crews, could not be replaced, while Allied strength grew daily as reinforcements and equipment flowed across the Atlantic in quantities that dwarfed German production. The clear skies of late December 1944 that allowed P-47s to hunt German armor also symbolized the end of any hope that Germany could avoid total defeat. Kruger's final assessment, recorded in 1946, captured the psychological reality of facing overwhelming air power. We were not defeated by better soldiers or superior tactics. We were destroyed by an enemy that could strike from the sky whenever the sun was shining, against which all our training and courage meant nothing. The bravest tank commander could do nothing when bombs fell from aircraft he never saw, when machine gun bullets came from planes moving too fast to track, when his men died in burning vehicles before they could fire a shot in defense. This was not war as we understood it, but industrial slaughter carried out by machines against men who had already lost before the battle began. The P-47 Thunderbolt continued serving as the primary American ground attack aircraft through the end of the European War, destroying thousands of vehicles and providing close air support that saved countless American lives. But for the German Panzer crews who survived encounters with the Thunderbolts 8.50 caliber guns, the experience left psychological scars that never fully healed. The sound of aircraft engines could trigger panic responses decades after the war ended, while nightmares of burning tanks and helpless comrades persisted through lifetimes. The terror was not of death itself, which soldiers learned to accept, but of death that came without warning or opportunity to fight back. Death delivered by machines that turned warfare into an industrial process where individual courage and military skill became irrelevant calculations in a ledger of overwhelming material superiority.